what we're learning about is how the Shekhinah dwells, how God's presence dwells on anything in the world, what that could mean, which is a strange question, right? Because God's everywhere. So how can God's presence be more one place than another if God's everywhere? And we're also learning about how God filling the world is something we can understand a little better by understanding how our soul fills our body. So by understanding how my soul is filling my body right now, I get a glimpse at how it is that God is able to fill the world. And we're looking at one particular aspect right now, because when my soul fills my body, the place where it's most manifest, the place where the powers of the soul are most obvious is in my brain. Hopefully, maybe not in my case all the time, but it's supposed to be in my brain. So in my brain, I have the power of intellect, which is meant for my brain. I have the power of emotion, which is spread out in other places. I have the power of speech, the power of locomotion, power of hearing, sight. And from there, it radiates out to the other parts of my body with the other aspects of my soul. We're learning about what is that component in the cosmos. The component in the cosmos that God's whole being enters into first and then radiates to the rest of creation is Torah and mitzvahs, Torah and mitzvahs. It sounds so simple, but if you've been following, you know, it's quite complex when you look at it from the side of Kabbalah, because Torah and mitzvahs refers to Chabad, Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat of each of the various worlds. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at how the Shekhinah, this light that is meant to relate to the world and create the world, but would nullify the world, how it flows into this, something like a brain in my body. But in this case, it's the Chabad, the Torah mitzvahs, the intellect and ratzon, will of each world. And from there, that garment is able to endure and manage to contain the light of the Shekhinah, so the Shekhinah can then shine to the rest of the world and create it. And we're just at the point, we're on page 814 in the Tanya, 814 in this edition of the Tanya, chapter 52. We're saying, why is it that Torah and mitzvahs can endure this light of the Shekhinah, that the rest of creation would be nullified? The reason is because Torah and mitzvahs comes from way higher than the Shekhinah. Torah and mitzvahs comes from Chokhmah of Atzilus, Chokhmah of the highest spiritual world, not even a world, just an emanation. So because it comes from so much higher, then it can absorb something lower than itself. It's not impressed, it's not nullified. And it can come down, receive the light of the Shekhinah, and then boom, the Shekhinah radiates to the rest of the worlds. So it's a little trick of geometry in some sense. And let's go in now to the text, because we're just learning about why it is that Torah mitzvahs, God's Chokhmah, is so much higher than Malchus, than the Shekhinah. All caught up with me, and we have no idea what we're as much idea as I have. Good. So we're here on 814. De'ihu chakim velo v'chokhmah yediah v'chulu. Go ahead, Eleanor.
For he is wise. For he is wise with the For he is wise with the wisdom of Chokhmah of Azilut, but not with a knowledgeable wisdom and so forth.
I hear you have a lot of heart. You have a lot of a dog represents heart. So you have a lot of heart in your reading there. Beautiful. So God is wise. Now, I have my wisdom, you have your wisdom. So maybe we'll say, you know what? God's just, think of the biggest number you could think of, that times wiser than me. Something like my wisdom, but just because God's really much wiser. God's, you name the number, a Googleplex times my wisdom, now that's God's wisdom. That would be a mistake, says the Alter Rebbe, because of this quote. God is wise, but not with the wisdom you can know. Not with the wisdom you can know. No matter how big a computer I build, it still has a number of, I don't know, memory, whatever you call it, right? It still has computing power that you can put it. It's finite. There's a finite amount of computing power. I don't care how big it gets, I can know it. If I meet some other life form that's much more intelligent than me and its brain is infinitely, not infinitely, but as much as I can imagine larger than mine and is just much wiser, okay, but I can still understand if it's 1,000,000 times wiser than me, that I can know. because I know me and I know a million, and I can imagine me times a million. And so I know it. It's just much wiser than me. So they can beat me at chess, can out philosophize me, but it's not that I can't know that they're smarter than me. I do know. They're a million times smarter. There, I said it. God's intellect, God's wisdom is wise, but not in a way that we can know. Because what is infinite chokhmah? What could that mean? First of all, it means it's not divisible. It's not divisible. So let's do a little thought experiment here. I'm going to share my screen. So here we are. We're talking about not my wisdom, but God's wisdom.
You have to say that he has wisdom. Defines it, though. Correct.
Correct. We've been through that there is a debate. You can't even say God has wisdom, because now you're ascribing attributes to God that have definitions, and you can't do that. And so we went through that whole debate a number of times, that the Alter Rebbe said, what you're saying is true. You can't say God is wise until God emanates these sfirot, and then the light comes into the vessel, and you have the world of Atzilus, where there's a vessel called Chokhmah, and the basic undefined light of God goes into that vessel, and now you can say God is wise. But before Atzilus, you can't say that. So
Can you say that God is wisdom?
you can't say anything about above Atzilus. There's nothing you can say about God. So we have trouble discussing anything. But all wisdom comes from God. So there, at some level, there's a point where there's a vessel with that simple light going into it. So if you're looking at, you can come around and look at the screen here if you're in the room with me. So here we have a little something, say from NLP or a lot of other studies. So if this is me, I'm looking at a thing, and here's the thing. Now, what do? I take that thing and I make a map of that thing in my mind, right? Map of that thing in my mind. So with me and you, we have three components to wisdom. We have the knowledge, which is here in my mind. We have the knower, that's the me who knows it. And we have the known, which is the thing that I know about. And the known, whatever I'm looking at, whether it's the entire world or whether it's a pencil, the knowledge, the territory is not the map in my mind. The known is not the knowledge. And of course, the knower is also not either of those. So we have three aspects to knowledge: knowledge, known, and knower. Sorry.
Oh, my God.
No, look.
Maya's got to send us.
I'm looking at a pencil, right?
Yeah.
The pencil is not my image of the pencil in my mind, right? They're different. The image of the pencil in my mind is not the pencil. They're different.
Right.
And then there's me. Until I looked at it, I didn't have that image. And I added that to my mind. So that's not me either. Correct?
Yeah.
Alex, would you agree that the knowledge, the knower, and the known are separate normally? Like if you look at this pencil,
Yeah, no, for sure.
there's you,
Yeah,
there's this pencil, and you got a picture of the pencil in your mind.
yeah.
Those are three separate
The
things.
signifier and this,
I've written down.
right, symbol of the sign,
Very nice.
right?
Good.
Yes.
So that's with us. Now, what Maimonides and the Alter Rebbe is saying is that with us, oh, by the way, guys, we actually we're broadcasting. Thanks. What Maimonides is saying is that that's the aspect that we can't understand God, because in God, it's all just one, right? There's not the knower, there's not the known, it's just one. Knowledge, knower, and known are united.
Okay.
And anyone who explains this says, and there's no way you can get this.
That's what Maimonides said.
Yeah, the brightest person in the world cannot understand how God's knowledge and what God knows and God are all actually the same thing united, because that's so different from us. No matter how wise someone gets, they still have their knowledge, they have what they know, the known, and then they have themselves, and they're separate. So we can't even begin, not even one thought, to understand how it is that God knowing this cup or the world or a mountain, that actually is the world. It's not separate. There's no difference between the mountain and God's knowledge of the mountain and God. It's all one thing. Make sense? So that's why when we say God's chokhmah is so much higher, it's an unknowable amount higher than any other chokhmah. It's primarily because of this, and also, of course, because of just the sheer volume and it's quantitative and qualitative. And here we are.
Can you have Maya send us those pictures? Can you
Blue
mind?
netter with this. We'll
Careful.
try and do that.
Yeah.
You see all the wires? So now we see how it is that God is wise, but not with a wisdom we can know. And as we just explained, the infinite light of the Ein Sof is clothed in and united with the supernal wisdom, and God's wisdom are united. They're one. Unlike us, where we're components, right? I may not know Italian. It's not part of me. And I could spend a year learning Italian, and a year it'd be included in my knowledge. But I was still here beforehand. And, I could learn all the capitals of every country in the world and I could forget them. And I'm still me. I didn't vanish. So whether new knowledge is added to me or I forget old knowledge, I'm still here. I'm separate from that knowledge. It's added to me. רק שיורדה בסתר המדרגות ממדרגה למדרגה בהשתלשלות העולמות עד שנתלבשה בדברים גשמיים שהן תרי"ג מצוות התורה. Why don't you go ahead, Paula? Only this. Or Susan, why don't you go ahead? See, Paula's not at her camera.
Only
right now.
this is because supernal wisdom in the Torah has descended by means of obscuring gradations from a higher grade to a lower grade with the descent of the worlds until the Torah, has clothed itself in material things, namely the 613 commandments of the Torah.
Right, so we see how the Torah now is much higher than the Shekhinah because it comes from God's Chokhmah, which is united with the Ein Sof. It is basically godliness. It hasn't left godliness. But it can be a vessel, it can be a garment for the Shekhinah because it actually descends. It comes down and is hidden and hidden and hidden. And we'll see in a little more detail how it comes down through each of the spiritual worlds and how each aspect of the Torah not only corresponds to one of the spiritual worlds, but actually creates that spiritual world because of its nature. But that's for a little later. But after coming down that way, what does the Torah finally enclose itself in? When you sit down and learn Torah, what are you mainly talking about? You're learning what?
613
Commandments. Okay, so the commandments involve what? Like you're dealing with what?
life to be good.
Behavior.
Behavior with you. Behavior involves what? You're behaving with what? If I come in and I'm holding a shawl and you're holding the shawl and we're arguing about it, we're arguing about what? The shawl, right? The physical thing, right? There's a cow and you're not sure if it's kosher or not kosher. It's an argument about a what? A cow, a physical thing, right? So in the end, the Torah came down, and the majority of the Torah, it's how to deal with physical things in the physical world. It's physical stories that happen in the physical world that we're told. It's mainly coming down and you're dealing with animals and you're dealing with money and you're dealing with rocks and you're dealing with land. The Torah came down and it mainly expressed itself in the very bottom of reality. And I can sit and I can learn it because I can understand a shawl, right? I can't understand God's wisdom and how one thought of God is united with God, et cetera, but that's okay because it came right down here through this whole system. And now what is enclosed in? A shawl. And if you and I are fighting over a shawl, I can understand that. I want the shawl, right? And wait, I have to give up half and tear it or sell it or whatever. So it came down right down to the bottom of physical reality. And that's how it's low enough to function as a garment where whatever world the Shekhinah now wants to relate to, Torah's right there. It's like, okay, don't wait, hold hold that light back. You're going to nullify this world now. Flow into me first, because I can go as low as I need to go. I can go as low as, did you move the marker on your land too far? And now, did you break the Torah, right? I'm right down and fit in the physical world. So as low as each spiritual world goes, the Torah can go down, create a garment to receive the Shekhinah, and then that's the brain through which the Shekhinah can now illuminate and actually create that world. Make sense? Well, it's actually the most inspiring thing to me, right? Because I can sit and learn the Torah for Dummies version, but what's in there? It's God's chachma. It's like the very beginning of all of creation. It's still in there, right? So I can look at it like, oh, I'm memorizing yet another rule about a cow's lung. Or I can look at it like, wow, here I am. I'm able to actually ingest God's own chachma. It gets very exciting. Going on. ובירידתה בהשתלשלות מעולם לעולם, גם השכינה יורדה נתלבשה בה בכל עולם ועולם. Let's, Paul, can you go ahead for me at the top of 8:15 if you unmute? And we're at top of 8:15 as this wisdom.
Here, I can do that.
There
Okay.
you go.
As this wisdom came down by progressive descents from world to world, the Shekinah too came down and clothed itself in each world.
This is exactly what we're talking about. We'll go through each of the spiritual worlds and look at the level of Torah. It's fascinating. But the general rule, this Shekhinah cannot actually interact with the world. It would nullify the world. It needs a garment to flow into. Torah is that garment. And each world, the Torah comes down again. The Shekhinah flows into it, and then the light emanates from the Torah. And because of the nature of the Torah of that world, that creates the quality of that spiritual world, whether it's Bria, Asiya, etc. Go ahead, Dan. This is the shrine. Why don't you do the next two?
This is the shrine of the Holy of Holies, which is contained in each world.
וכמו שכתוב בזוהר ועץ חיים, שהשכינה שהיא מלכות אצילות, שהיא בחינת גילוי אור אינסוף ברוך הוא, וחיות שמאיר לעולמות, ולכן היא נקראת דבר השם ברוח פיו כביכול.
So also has it been stated in the Zohar and Eitz Chaim that the Shekhinah, which is the Malchut of Atzilut, being the manifestation of the light and vitality of the blessed Ein Sof, which illumine the worlds, wherefore, that is, since it is a revelation, it's called God's speech and the breath of his mouth, as it were. For the purpose of speech is to reveal that which was concealed in thought.
If we go through all the aspects, all the sfirot of Atzilus, you find the intellect of God, the emotions of God, and finally Malchut, which we call Peh, which we call the speech, God's expression. So the Shekhinah is like God speaking. And of course, when God speaks, that's creation of worlds. But now when we're actually here learning the Torah, understanding it is the vessel that is receiving that light, we can understand what's in it, right? Rashi calls it Mashal HaKadmon, the analogy of the original one. Mashal HaKadmon. So the Kadmon, the original one, that's God. And God is trying to tell us an analogy, like a metaphor. God's saying, you know what? Let me put it this way, right? And we spoke, I think, last week about how it was said that Shlomo knew 3,000 parables, 3,000 analogies. And that doesn't just mean Shlomo could explain something 3,000 different ways. It meant Shlomo could put something into lower and lower and lower words 3,000 times in a row until something Shlomo understood could finally be put into a context I could understand. So Shlomo might be telling me a story about a family making food. Okay, you get that? Now let me tell you another story about a banker counting money, but it's really an analogy for the lower story. Now let me tell you a story about a garden and there's a tree in the garden, but that's an analogy for this story, which is an analogy for that story. And slowly Shlomo HaMelech could bring my level up, analogy upon analogy, until finally, after 3,000 analogies, I could finally get a glimpse of what it was Shlomo was trying to explain to me. But in each of those analogies, what is there? There's the original idea that Shlomo had. Shlomo brought the original idea down. Same thing here, but infinitely so. God is trying to tell us something, trying to give us a sense of this infinite light and this infinite wisdom. And to do that, God has to also, so to speak, tell an analogy, speak. That comes out as the Shekhinah. But it has to go down through many, 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 many different levels and analogies till it gets to us. But each one of them, the Torah is there to receive that light. and shined it into that particular world until it gets to the bottom. But even here in the bottom, when there's been infinite worlds and infinite different analogies, level upon level, what's in this final analogy? The same Or Ein Sof that was in the original, right? This is the analogy of the original one. So when I open the Torah, whatever level I'm learning, even if it's just basic halakha, nuts and bolts, know that gets you connected to the Ein Sof, exactly like if you were an angel in the world of Bria. Now they see it more, it affects them more, okay, but the level of Ein Sof is still in there, right? Make sense?
I think so.
It's the same level of Ein Sof.
It's the Ein Sof. It's the Ein Sof. The essence of the Ein Sof doesn't have levels, right?
You're saying that any Torah study
Yeah,
is equal to any other Torah study.
correct. Yeah, the Ein Sof is in all of them. The original Ein Sof that shone into the Shekhinah, or even into Chochmah of Atzilus, that is the analog that's going into the analogy. That is the original idea that's going into the story. And no matter how many times the story is brought down, the original analog, the Ein Sof, is still in that story.
So the study of Torah by a Rasha is equal to the study of Torah by a Tzaddik.
From this perspective, yeah. Even more, maybe, because God's like, oh, Russia, I've been waiting for him to learn Torah. It's mind-blowing to me, right? It's if we could put that frame of reference in our mind when we open the Torah, imagine the connection, the awe, the wonder that it has. It's like, I'm trying to find God in this world, and boom, right there, no matter what I'm learning. It's amazing. Al derech mashal kmo shebe'adam hadibur hu megale machashavto hastuma v'ne'lama laha shomim.
As in the case of a person, by way of example, speech reveals to the hearers the speaker's concealed and hidden thought.
So we learned about hidden worlds and concealed worlds, and that was one of the names of the Shekhinah, of Malchus V'Tzilus, was Alma Diskalia, the revealed world. So speech, it's another one of these analogies. God is trying to say, I want Smolash to understand something about how I created the world. So I'm going to give him a mouth. And what's that mouth going to do? It's going to be able to say things, and it'll feel to Smolash like something was hidden inside of him, a thought, an intellectual flow, and he had a feeling. And then he said something, and now that feeling and that thought was revealed to people around him. And maybe if he lives long enough and says enough Narishkeit, he'll recognize, oh, I'm trying to teach him something. That's how the world's being created. God has something hidden in God's infinite light. God does something like speech that we're calling the Shekhinah, that we're calling Malchus. And then something is revealed now that otherwise was just hidden in this infinite light. And from there, worlds can be created until there's actually a physical world that looks like, wow, this is revealed, right? This is really here. So very similar to speech.
Last week you mentioned something about that the Torah was the blueprint for the universe. That was there before anything else.
Yeah.
Is there any commentary about why are there stories in the Torah that talk about things that didn't happen when it was created? How do you wrap your head around that?
Okay, so there's a few to bring people up to speed. The question was, last week we talked about how the Torah is the blueprint of the world. It says in the Zohar, God looked into the Torah to create the world. And one thing we brought out was something we learned from this is that there's nothing in the world that can be made worse by bringing it into line with the Torah's wisdom. Some people think, okay, there's the Torah and being a good Jew, and then there's the world and its laws. And if I keep Shabbat, it means I'll make less money, right? If I don't lie, it means I'll do worse in business. And the Rebbe of this tradition said, no, it's the opposite. The Torah is the blueprint of the world. The Torah is the computer code of the world. So everything in the world is coming through the Torah. It all has to flow with the Torah's logic. And if you keep the Torah, you're actually going to do better in the world. And there's many miraculous stories of stuff like that happening. Now you're asking, the question is, if the Torah was the blueprint of the world, how does it have stories in it that didn't happen until the world was created? Right? So here I am, I'm looking to the blueprint of the world, and I see a story that Abraham did such and such. And then I create the world, and thousands of years later, there's this person, Abraham, does such and such, but that hasn't happened yet, right? So how is that in the blueprint? That's your question? Yeah. So to answer, we got to specify what we mean by before or blueprint, right? So blueprint is like above conceptually. It also comes before in time, so it's confusing. But part of the blueprint of the world, as we said, was the creation of everything, including time, including space. So when we say God looked into the blueprint of the world, you can't imagine the world is so and so many years old. Now go before that and imagine another 1,000 years earlier, God's looking at his blueprint, because there's no time. Time hasn't been created yet before God starts creating the world. There's just God, right? God's just oneness. God's not in time, right? Time is in God once God creates it. So when God looks into the world, that's before there's time, before there's space. So God doesn't really have a problem of saying, wait, hold on, this didn't happen yet. How would I know that Abraham's going to, like, how can I look into this, something that happened later? There's not even time. It's like the Big Bang, if you will, that all of time and space is just in one little point, and that's within God. And God's like, I could create anything, including time. So all that, every potential was included in God's first thought. When God looks at the Torah, that included everything that could ever happen, including the stories that would be in the Torah and the time that they would happen and the space that they would happen. That was all also included in that point of creation.
So there's no time. Time is our concept, not God's concept.
Time is also God's concept. Time, God created time, right? And we're getting very philosophical, right? Our perception of time is not God's perception of time, because we perceive time as just the perception of change. And we only see our own point in time. We remember the past, we imagine the future, but time for us is perception of change. Time for God is just the same as physical world.
So this is why God knows what's going to happen. It's not necessarily predetermined, he just knows it.
It's a good way of putting it. Yeah, the comment was, and we'll get back to the text shortly. So how can God know what's going to happen? Doesn't that mean we don't have free choice? Right? And you say, well, it's not predetermined. God just knows it. So right now I'm talking. I've been talking for half an hour, and you know I'm talking, right? Are you forcing me to talk? But you know I'm talking, right? But you can know I'm talking, and it's my free will choice to speak, right? So we don't have a problem that one being can be aware of another being doing something, but being aware of their speaking is not the same as making them speak. I have free will, you're just aware. So the only difference, if you like, if this is time, this is the circle of time, this is now, that's the past and that's the present, and they meet, I guess, at infinity somewhere or something. In this circle of time, I'm only aware of this exact point I'm in, and you're aware of this exact point we're in, and you're aware that I'm speaking. But the same way you being aware of me speaking doesn't take away my free will, so does God being aware of my speaking not take away my free will. But guess what? God can see every point in time all at once. So you can imagine this thing that's happening now between you and me, that's happening because God's above time, God's created time. God's looking at every point in time and saying, yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm seeing what you're doing, right? At every point in time. I'm like, but hold on, that hasn't happened yet. That's the future. That means I don't have free will. No, you're doing it by your free will at that time, which I'm looking at. You just can't see every point in time, right? So that's the best way I've seen to understand we actually do have free will, and yet God is aware of everything we're going to do. It's actually not a problem. It's just that we don't understand how God sees time. That's our limitation. Let's go back inside. We drift off. Yes. So top of 816. Yeah. He mitlabeshet behechal k'che karashim divriya shehi v'chokhma bina dat divriya uvihit labshutan b'malchut divriya nivru hanshamot v'hamalachim shebabriya. Let's start again. Eleanor, if you don't mind unmuting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Clothes itself in the shrine of the Holy of Holies of Berea, namely the Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at of Berea. Through the fact that the latter Sifrot, clothe themselves in the Malchut of Berea, the souls and angels which exist in the world of Berea have been created.
So that once the Shekhinah goes through Malchus of the Shekhinah is Malchus of Atzilus. Once it enters the Chabad of the world of Bria, the next world, which is the world of intellect, let's call it, the world of creation and intellect. And once it enters that world, now finally the Shekhinah can create a world without nullifying it. Because it's entered the Chabad of that world, the Torah and mitzvahs of that world, now it can create the beings of Bria, the angels of Bria, the souls of Bria, everything that's in Bria, which is still a highly abstract conceptual world, right? That world is only defined as having the potential to exist. It has no other definition. So it's the most abstract thing we could think of with no definition whatsoever, not, not form, not emotion, not just intellectual abstract potential to exist. That's the nature of that world. And there, now that world can be created because the Ein Sof, the light of the Shekhinah, has entered into the Chabad of Bria. V'gam misham, and here we go to the Torah, nimshach Talmud shelefanenu. Yeah, now Eleanor, you take us on this one. From there?
And from there also, from Malchut of Berea, in which is enclosed the Shekinah, that is Malchut of Azilut, which previously had clothed itself in the Chokmah, Bina, and Dat of the world of Berea, after which the later are clothed in the Malchut of the world of Berea, derives the Talmud as we possess.
So now we're going to see, now we're going to see that each of the levels of the Torah, and it's amazing how this just all fits together once you learn it, that things that seem just random names and levels and parts of Torah, it actually fits into how the Ein Sof is creating the world as a grid. It's beautiful, and each level defines itself. So from the world of Bria, from there, that becomes the physical pages of the Talmud that we possess, the oral tradition, right? And what's the connection? And we'll see in each one. The Talmud represents the intellectual arguments about the rulings, right? So Mishnah, which is a level below that, represents just the rulings. So, God said, this is kosher, this isn't, this is allowed, this isn't, right? Now, why God might have thought that, that's all these conversations in the Talmud, where you have so-and-so bringing this brisa and so-and-so bringing this proof and knocking this down and arguing this, and well, hold on, it might be this circumstance, and endless intellectual exploration and debate to try and figure out and touch what was God's thinking behind that feeling. Right? When God said, no, that's not kosher, or that's forbidden. What was the thought that God had originally that led to that feeling in God? Just like a person, you might say, wow, my boss doesn't want me to do this or that. I wonder why, I wonder what's in their mind. You might wonder that, try and get into their head and see, why did my boss make that decision? Then I can understand them better, right? Or a spouse or anyone. So the Talmud, that represents the intellectual level of the Torah. And that's why it's not just that the physical Talmud comes down from that level. It's that is the level of Torah that the Shekhinah entered. And then, like entering a room, the color of the air in that room, or whatever you're going to have, defines the light that goes into the rest of the house in that level, right? So because the Talmud, that's the level that is intellectual, when the Shekhinah enters the Chabad of Bria, that is the spiritual Talmud. And because it's intellectual, now the light that goes to the rest of the world of Bria, that's an intellectual light by definition. So the spiritual level of the Talmud, that is intellectual Torah, that is creating the world of Bria, that is an intellectual world. Make sense?
I just don't know how the Talmud gets involved in that.
How does the Talmud get involved?
Yeah. Why?
It's a little easier when you go through all the levels. So let me quickly take you through. And then I want to take some time to talk about Tisha B'Av, which is coming up. Right. So the 1, 2, 3, right? The three levels we're going to look at. Talmud creates the world of Bria. Mishnah creates the world of Yetzirah. and then the Tanakh creates the world of Asiya, the world of action, right? So compared to those others, let's look at the Talmud, right? Mishnah is just yes or no, right? You know, what's your decision, right? Once I've made a decision, once I said, no, I don't want to go on that vacation, I want to go on this vacation, right? I don't want to buy that jacket, I want to buy this jacket. I'm done thinking, now I have a feeling. And my feeling is I'm going that way, right? There might have been a lot of different intellectual reasons why this jacket and that jacket, and I weighed them all, and those intellectual reasons are still there. But finally I have a feeling, and the feeling is either yes or no, right or left, red or green, right? So the feeling, that's what makes the simple decision. Mishnah is just those simple decisions, right? It's a yes or no, kosher or not kosher, allowed or not allowed. And that represents emotion. And by the way, you see there's 6 Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 books of Mishnah. That corresponds to the 6 midot, the 6 emotions. So Mishnah is all about the emotions. And spiritually, we'll see Mishnah is what creates the emotional world of Yetzirah. Compared to Mishnah, the Talmud is the intellectual reasons behind the rulings. Does that make more sense, Noreen?
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, the Tanakh, that is how we actually connect to the physical world, or maybe it's halacha. I gotta go through here. Yeah, but the Gemara, the actual Talmud, that is the intellectual level that creates Bria. Yeah, going through. As has been uchmo shnitbaer le'el b'shem hatikunim. Go ahead, Susan.
As has previously been explained in the name of the tikkunim.
So this is not just in here, but the Zohar, etc., described that the Talmud comes from the world of Bria. Shebe'olam haBria meirot umashpiot sham chokhmato uvinato v'dato shel Ein Sof Baruch Hu b'vchinat tzimtzum atzum b'chdei sheyuchlu hanashamot v'hamalachim shehem ba'alei gvul v'tachlit לקבל השפעה מבחינת חוכמה בינה דעת אלו. Why don't you go on a little more, Susan?
That in the world of Berea, there shine and flow forth the Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat of the Ein Sof in a powerfully contracted manner, in order that the souls and the angels, which are finite beings, shall be able to receive an influence from the categories of Chabad.
So Chabad itself, pure intellect, that's Chokhmah, that defines the world of Atzilus, and that would nullify the world of Bria. But Bina, the intellectual reasoning that you could actually follow it, you could say, okay, that's logical, that this disproves that, but hold on, this exception disproves that disproof, right? That Bina light, that lives in the world of Bria. And so once it clothes itself in the Chabad of Bria, which is the Torah of the Talmud, now that intellectual light, that is able to flow into a world without nullifying it. It's flowed into the garment that can conceal the Shekhinah for that level, and it defines that level and it creates it. And then the actual physical Gemara comes down from there. So when you learn Gemara, you're connecting with the Chabad of that world, the world of Bria. Therefore, ולכן נמשך משם התלמוד שהוא גם כן מבחינת חוכמה בינה דעת, שהתלמוד הוא טעמי ההלכות על בוריין, והטעמים הם מבחינת חוכמה בינה דעת. Paula, do you want to take this one? Therefore,
I have to unmute.
You're good. You're unmuted. I hear you.
Okay. Therefore, the Talmud, not the Mishnah, but the Gemara, also originates from the world of Berea. For it, the Talmud is also of the category of Chabad. For the Talmud is, i.e., therefore, it conceits of the clearly defined reasons of the halachot, and the reasons being rational are from the category of Chabad intelligence.
Make enough sense?
So when you say Torah, you're talking about all of Jewish learning.
Basically, all of Jewish learning. Yeah. So Torah is everything. Gemara, Mishnah, the entire Tanakh. The Tanya. It's all Torah.
Yeah.
But the different levels have different qualities, as we're seeing. So, for instance, when you read something from the Tanakh, or when you read the Torah specifically, it actually has a holiness that permeates the words itself. And that's why it's connected to the world of asiya, of action. And it doesn't matter if I understand the words or not in terms of, is it a mitzvah? The holiness is in the words themselves. So when I learn something from the oral Torah, if I learn Gemara, and I'm just reciting the Aramaic and the Hebrew, whatever, but I don't understand it at all, I actually haven't achieved anything by Kabbalah's standards, right? Because there's nothing holy about the actual words of the Gemara. It's only the ideas that are holy. I have to comprehend them, right? And then when I speak them, it connects to something. But the physical Torah, that, because it's the level of asiya, it has a different quality where the words themselves are infused with kedusha. And so when I go into a blessing for the Torah, whether I understand it or not, it's still a mitzvah. I'm still connecting to God's light. So that each of these levels, even though we're saying it's all the Torah, each of these levels is very distinct in terms of how you interact with it, what world it creates, and what its own definitional qualities are. Right, the world of Bria and Talmud is very different than the world of asiya and learning like the 5 books of Moses or reading from a scroll. And now we go to the laws themselves, which is Mishnah. Halachot atzman hen midotav shalin sof baruch hu shehen chesed din rachamim kulu. Dan, why don't you go ahead?
And the laws themselves, found in the Mishnah, derived from the emotive attributes of the Ein Sof, namely kindness, severity, mercy, and so on.
So see how beautiful this is, and as an entire model, God's chokhmah, God's wisdom comes down into chokhmah v'tzilus. You have Atzilus, which is just this hidden world, it's just godliness. That all flows into malchus of Atzilus, which is the revealed world. And finally, that can flow into the Chabad of Bria. And now that's defined by bina instead of chokhmah, by cognitive, knowable intellect, like rational, logical cognition. And so that is defined by the Gemara and the Talmud and all those rational intellectual arguments that go there. That's God's Chabad, that's God's intellect, as it is creating a world. And now I have God's feelings. We've gone through God's intellectual flow as much as we can. And now the light from Malchus of Bria, the bottom of the world of Bria, now flows into the Chabad, the Torah of the world of Yetzirah. And now we're all about God's feelings. I'm getting to know God. I've gotten to know God's intellect to the extent I can. Now I want to know how God feels, right? Okay, we've gone through the intellectual, but guess what? We can have meanwhile, you can have a long conversation about something. I can understand everything she thinks. I can understand every reason why it should be X. And then she can turn around and say, you know what? I want Y. She wants Y, right? That's who she is. That's what she wants. That's her.
I'm in trouble with the Mishnah being associated with the emotions because the emotions are lower than the intellect.
Yeah. So in terms of a source text, and it flips, right? In terms of source text, the Mishnah comes before the Gemara, so we think the Mishnah is higher, right? The Mishnah is the higher rulings, and the Gemara is explaining them. So in terms of like how the text comes out and was developed, the Mishnah is before the Gemara, and the Gemara can't contradict the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is higher in terms of authority.
So why would that relate to the emotions rather than the intellect, if the intellect comes before the emotions?
Yeah, because this isn't halakhically how it relates. This is kabbalistically how it came out of the Ein Sof. So it flips.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that seems kind of funny.
Yeah, because God wasn't through the period of Jewish history going, you know what, I have this idea, and then let me finally have a feeling about it. Now my feeling comes out, right? God wasn't following us as we got the Mishnah and then developed the Talmud. We're trying to discover what God is above all time, right? So here in Kabbalah, the Mishnah is related to emotions because it's just plain yes and no, and that's an emotional thing. Right, you sit down at a restaurant, and there's a big menu, and I see there's the lasagna. Oh boy, that would taste really good, and but hold on, the carbs and the this and that. And then there's, there's some fried foods. And like, okay, maybe I'd like that. But I go through all the intellectual reasons of why I should order this and that. And maybe I shouldn't have wine today. I go through it. And then the waiter comes and they say, what would you like? And I say, I feel like lasagna and a big glass of wine, right? So whatever the meaning, whatever the intellectual flow was. And I thought, maybe easy on the carbs and be easy on the wine. Finally, I have a feeling. Maybe my intellectual rationale was strong enough that my feeling is I'll have a salad, but maybe it's not. Maybe I'm going to have lasagna anyways, right? So when I get down to the actual decision, right, not all the reasons back and forth, but the decision, that's emotions. That's why the Mishnah, which is like, it is or it isn't, it's allowed or it's not allowed. The Mishnah is God's emotions. I hear what you're saying. It like precedes the Gemara halakhically, but in terms of Kabbalah, it's the emotions.
You're saying that the actual written part of the Torah is above all.
Yeah. So halakhically, the Torah is the highest thing. Then the Mishnahs are the rulings that came out of the Torah. Like it says in the Torah, don't murder a person. And therefore the Mishnah says, you're not allowed to murder. That's a halakha. Then the Gemara comes lower in halakha and says, okay, what is murder? What is manslaughter? What is self-defense? And so legally, the Torah is the highest thing. And then it goes down through the Mishnah and the Gemara. But everything typically spiritually flips, right? There's a saying that the thing that falls from the highest place falls farthest. The thing that falls from the highest place falls farthest. So in fact, in terms of where it is spiritually, the Gemara represents God's intellect. The Mishnah represents God's emotions. And the Tanakh, that's actually now God's coming down and God's like, okay, I'm connecting to reality here. Actual physical words, and my own divine light is going to be in that. So it is upside down compared to how it works halakhically.
That's going to take some.
It's a good point. It's a good point. I don't think anywhere here he addresses like why it is that it's upside down compared to, you naturally think Torah is higher than Mishnah. Mishnah is higher than Gemara because the Mishnah can't argue with the Torah theoretically, right? If it says something in the Torah, the Mishnah has to follow that. In terms of connecting with the Ein Sof, the Ein Sof is in all of them, right? So whatever you're learning, the Ein Sof is there. Yeah. All right, let's take a few moments to talk about Tisha B'Av, which is this. It's actually Saturday, but we don't fast on Shabbos, so we move it off. We move it to Sunday. And this is, I know as Reformed Jews, sometimes the fast days are not so high on our radar, but nowhere in Reformed Judaism does it say you're not allowed to fast. We haven't nullified these fast days, so these apply to us as well. And of course, we can observe them in many, many different ways. So if you'd like to observe the fast Tisha B'Av, we'll go through a few ways you can do it. But what does it commemorate? Of course, you're probably familiar. What happened on Tisha B'Av? The biggest things.
Breaking down the walls of the city.
That was
a big fast of Thomas.
Yeah.
17 Thomas.
Yeah, and then 3 weeks later,
the
destruction of the temple. Both temples were destroyed on this date, and many other negative things happened. And if you can imagine, I think Reformed Judaism has an ambiguous relationship with the temple because we're not really praying for the return of the temple and a rebuilding of the temple coming down spiritually from heaven. That's not something that most Reformed Jews think about. But the temple stood for a lot of things. It was the national center where we all went. And it was, as we're learning, a place where something happened, where God was actually manifest in the physical, where you went and you made a sacrifice, you took part in whatever he was doing, and you said, no, the thing that you just imagine and you try to connect to abstractly, I saw something like with my physical eyes. It was God's presence. God's Shekhinah was there, obvious. And you come back and you're inspired and you're connected and you have enough energy and joy to go through till the next festival. And we all did it together. And imagine what it was like to have that. Imagine what it's like to bring your children up and bring them and have them see this, and they're going to tell their children, and this is who we are. And then suddenly it's gone, it's destroyed. And there's this connection we had to something that you can't otherwise reach for yourself. Now it's gone. And you think, well, we rebuilt the last one, we'll rebuild this one, and 50 years goes on, 100 years, and you're praying and mourning and praying and mourning. And now 2,000 years, right? 2,000 years. So there's something that we all inherited, that we all somehow remember way back in our genes, where we're all together, we could all see exactly this, what we're learning. And it was gone, it was destroyed. So even if you're not a person that imagines like, wow, what I want to happen tomorrow is a physical temple be built and sacrifice to be brought, and I want to stop doing all these prayers and bring a nice ox and a sheep, still, each of us have this point inside of us that corresponds to the Holy of Holies in the temple, and working for the Messianic period, which is what Reformed Judaism is working for too. That involves that coming out, that temple being rebuilt in each of us. So there's something spiritual that is exactly like what was happening. And if you want to mark this, you want to be part of it. What are the main ways that we observe Tisha B'Av on in this case, on Sunday, right? Because we don't fast on Saturday. So we'll start our observances Saturday night through Sunday night. Biggest one is fasting. That's, people always ask me, when you fast, does that also mean not drinking water? It's like, I mean, in holistic medicine, there's such a thing as a fast where you are drinking fluids, but in Judaism, a fast is just nothing goes in your mouth. So no food, no water from sunset on Saturday night to 3 stars on Sunday night. But if you have a medical problem, you fast as long as you can. Don't fast if it's going to be an issue. You can fast half the day. It's better than not fasting from that perspective. There's many other practices that are very easy to do also, that are part of Tisha B'Av, that if fasting is a little too much for you, you can just try these, and it's really pretty easy. Like, can anybody name any of the other observances?
No leather, no sex.
No leather shoes. No shoes. You can wear leather kippah, but you don't wear leather shoes. So basically, if you have a pair of canvas shoes or human-made material shoes, put those on Saturday night with the mind that you're doing this to observe Tisha B'Av, and you're observing one of the mitzvahs of Tisha B'Av, right? That's a big deal.
Reading Lamentations.
Reading Lamentations, if you can go somewhere where they read Echa, right? That's an important book, or learn it if you can't get there.
No oils or fancy things on your body.
Yeah, so you don't no deodorants, no lotions, no potions. You don't anoint yourself with anything. So you just kind of like, you don't even wash actually, except your fingers. Like if you're making food, you wash for the break fast, or if your hands get dirty from whatever, you go to the bathroom, you wash. But even when you wake up in the morning, you wash just up to the knuckles, right? You don't just go wash your hands or take a shower to be clean. Saturday night to Sunday night, you just kind of let it be, and everybody's in their own thing.
And no sex.
No sex. So if you have the sexes in your world, you don't have the sexes as an observance of Tisha B'Av. And in fact, it goes beyond. Many people actually don't even greet each other. So you wouldn't kiss hello, you wouldn't have a handshake, you wouldn't say good morning, how are you, right? You just, everybody kind of sticks to themselves, and you're in almost like a state of mourning.
Is it always the same as Yom Kippur? Same.
A lot of it's the same. Yeah, a lot of the same. Yom Kippur, you don't sit on a low chair. Yeah, so one of the things people do is they don't sit on this regular sized chair. You get like a little stool or a bench, and you just sit on that, or you take the cushions off of your couch and you sit down low. So for the first half of the day, you sit low as if you're in a house of mourning, right? And another thing that many people find hard is you're not allowed to learn Torah other than Torah associated with Tisha B'Av. So like sitting down and learning some nice Tanya, which is like a pleasure for us, you don't give yourself that pleasure on Tisha B'Av. From Saturday night to Sunday midday, you don't learn Torah other than the laws of Tisha B'Av, etc. So there's lots of easy stuff that we can do if you want to observe Tisha B'Av and start to bring this point back where the Shekhinah is really dwelling in a manifest way. I hope that you'll take us up on some of that. We're going to finish with a quick meditation, then come back next week. We have a class. Beautiful. So just find yourself in a nice, relaxed position. And slow your breathing down. We'll bring our breath into 4 stages, breathing in nice and long, keeping the breath in, breathing out nice and long, and then keeping ourselves empty. So Your breath is a nice big flow. We'll count 4 counts for each of those stages. So in for 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep the breath in, 2, 3, 4. Back out, 2, 3, 4. Now stay empty. 2, 3, 4. Once again, in, 2, through your nose if you can. 4, staying full. 2, 3, 4. Empty out. 2, 3, 4. Staying empty. Keep going through that cycle, and if you like, bring your belly into the breathing, so you swell out as you breathe in, and then the belly pulls back up to the diaphragm when you breathe out. Nice. Let's open up our wisdom gateway. It's that space between the end of the in-breath and the beginning of the out-breath. That will be our wisdom gateway. Very good to open. Let that happen in your own way. And it's opening up, so you're seeing it as well inside. You can make the wisdom gateway nice and clear, nice and big, can you not? And now that we all have it established, let's put this concept in the wisdom gateway. Whatever Torah we learn, the Ein Sof is hidden within it, that is contained within it. As this analogy comes down, whatever level, the very light of the Ein Sof is contained within that Torah. Let that divine concept, place it in your wisdom gateway and let the details start to fill your mind. The image of that concept, of that divine light in Torah, if you're seeing it far away in your mind's eye, bring it closer. If you're seeing it on a small screen, perhaps expand the screen 10 feet, 20 feet wide. Color is good to add. Let the details fill your mind of this divine concept. The Ein Sof light is hidden within every word of Torah. And notice any emotions you're feeling as this concept fills your mind. Let those feelings, perhaps of joy, perhaps of awe, let them anchor themselves to every word of Torah, these beautiful letters, these books. So anytime I open a book, those feelings will emerge as if anchored to those beautiful texts. If you're with us in class, let's wiggle our toes and fingers, open our eyes. Yasher Koach. Beautiful learning this second to last chapter of the Tanya with you. I hope you'll join us. As always, email Maya at temple-israel.org if you want to get the links to learn with us on Zoom. If you're with us on YouTube or Facebook, it's been a pleasure as well. Ask any questions in the comments. I'll try to get to them. And wishing you a wonderful Shabbat and an easy fast.